Okay, so you can see I've got a pre-prepared outline here that I've traced. This is of my final piece design. The other thing that I need to go along with this is obviously the picture of the collage, which I've got on the computer screen beside me. It's important that I look at that image because that's going to show me where all the tone, the texture, the detail goes, so that I can start to make this look like it's got some sense of form and some sense of life and accuracy. The more realistic and the more accurate our drawings are, obviously the more marks that we're going to get and the more clearly we're going to communicate our concept and our intention, which is really important. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to start to work with some mixed medias, so layering different materials on top of each other with the aim of creating a sense of depth within my image. What I've got to think about when I'm doing that is the nature of materials. So if I start, let's say, I'm looking at my table and what I've got here, could I use oil pastels? I could, but if I use oil pastels, nothing else will layer on top of that because obviously it's got oil in it, so it's going to resist it and it's quite a thick material. So that's probably not something that I want to use on my bottom layer at all. I've got watercolours. That's a good place to start for our bottom layer because due to the fact that it's quite a thin and fine material, that means that we can layer things on top of it. I've also got some pens and pencils here. So I think what I'm going to use is some watercolour on the base to add a little bit of tonal depth and a little bit of colour. And then I'm going to build up that tonal depth, colour, texture, accuracy and detail using a combination of pen, pencil, maybe some coloured pens and some colouring pencils as well. So I'm just going to make a start on that now. Obviously when we're thinking about watercolour, and I've got my palette here, I know yours looks slightly different, but it's exactly the same. We're thinking about the nature of the material. And that's that it needs to be quite fluid and translucent, and we want to build it up to get a depth of tone. The tricky thing about watercolour is trying to get the right balance between pigment, which is the colour, and between water. We never want to overload the pigment with water because then it'll have no kind of tonal depth. The colour won't be very rich at all. So we always want to be very measured with the amount of water that we're adding and add more water as we go along to make it lighter if necessary. Also, when we're using watercolour, especially if we're not using watercolour paper, which I'm not, I'm just using cartridge paper, I don't want to keep on making the same repetitive marks because what's going to happen there is that then the paper is going to be compromised and I'm going to get lots of little bits coming up on the surface. So to make a start, I'm going to add a little bit of water to my brush. I'm just going to dip it in and then I'm going to take the excess off on the side. And I'm going to start around my eyes. So I'm going to have a darker tone. I think I'm going to work with blues and greens today. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of blue. And you can see I've only got enough water to make it loose. And just looking at that, I can see that it's quite dark and that's probably what I'm looking for. I'm going to add water as I go along. So I've got a little bit on my brush. And I'm going to start to add this into my dark area here. And putting it on, I can see that it's really dark. And that's good because I'm going to get the tonal depth in initially, which is what I want. And then I'm going to add it into some of the darkest areas around my eye, referring to my picture, so I know where that is. And that's really dark in there. I got a little bit of darkness around here. Once I've got that down, and I've got all of the darkest areas in, quite prominently, just thinking about the way that I hold my brush. So I've got lots of control because I'm holding it close to the end, to the bottom of the brush towards the tip, thinking about how much paint is on the tip of my brush because I know I can control it because I know exactly how much is on there. Now what I want to do, I'm just going to build that up a little bit more to make it a little bit darker, and then I want to lighten the tone coming from here. So it's dark there and then I want to graduate out lighter. So to do that, I'm just going to dip in the water to get some of the blue off my brush. And then I'm just going to, using the water, I got a little bit too much there. So I'm just going to, again, take off the excess because I can now spread this around. I'm just going to blend out like this. And I'm touching the paper very gently so that I'm not picking up any of the paper and I'm not spoiling the surface at all. I'm just touching it really gently. Then what I want to do, I want to start to blend some green into this. So I'm going to go, and I've already got water on my brush, so I'm not going to add any more. I'm going to go over to my green. I'm going to get a little bit, and then I'm going to, just where it's still wet, start to add that in. And whilst it's wet, those two colours are going to react, so they're going to blend quite well together. And I'm going to use the green whilst it's dark to get some of my outlining in, only where it's necessary, looking at my picture again and adding the darkest green tones in. If I'm thinking about what colours I'm choosing, the blue is my darkest, then the green is going to be my middle, and then obviously I'll have variations within those two. So at the minute I'm putting the darkest of the green in to re-emphasise some of the darkest areas, like so. And this will probably extend down here as well, looking at my image, so that I start to get some of that in. Have a little bit there. Now what I want to do again, I want to start to represent some of the lighter tones and blend that out. So I'm just going to get some water and I'm going to start to spread that out. I'm going back for more water because it's not as light as I want it to, so I'm going to clean any hue off my brush, and then you can see now I can start to really spread this out and get those lighter tones in. That tonal variation and that high contrast between the darkest and the lightest areas is going to start to create a sense of tone and depth within my image. And you can see that any marks that I leave are starting to follow the contours of the face. So here I know the eye socket is round, so I can follow that round like this. And then once that I've got that like that, there's a little bit of water. If there's any areas that are darker, I can just come and add that in. Not adding any more water, just picking up a little bit more pigment, like so. I'm gonna re-emphasize this bit. And you can see that I'm being really considered with my marks. I know what mark I want to put, and then I'm placing it. I'm not touching the same area over and over and over again, because I know that that's going to compromise my paper. And then just going like this. You'll see that if there's a lot of fluid on your paper, this will happen. The watercolour kind of takes on a life of its own and gets this really fluid nature and starts to spread out. That's a really nice quality as long as it's controlled and it's going where you want it to. So you can almost guide it into the paper. I'm just going to go around here. Now, looking at this and referring back to my collage, this reflection in the eye here is the lightest part. So I need to leave that the white of the paper, which means that the eye can't be the white of the paper. Now, white watercolour exists, but there's not much use to it, because what it tends to do is make your colours transparent. It tends to make your colours opaque, which isn't what we want with watercolour. We want that sense of transparency. So in order to represent that really light tone, which is happening in the eye there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix a little bit of my green with some yellow to make it more of a limey coloured green and a light coloured green. I'm going to have a lot of water on my brush, and then I'm just going to get that light tone in here. So you can see it just tints it slightly, but it's not overwhelming. And I'm also going to have that in this part here. I start to spread it around where some of my tones are lighter. Coming down the side of the face here, I also have some dark heavy tones, so I'm going to go back to that blue, which I know represents my dark heavy tone, and not a lot of water, so you can see I'm getting it really dark here. And then as it comes out from there, like this, following the contours of the face, which I've sketched in a little bit there as well, I can start to add some of the green that I want it to blend with, and just by overlapping them, touching them together there, not manipulating it too much, those two start to blend together. Then I'm going to clean my brush, and just with water I'm going to pull this out, getting it nice and fluid, like so, coming into the lightest parts of the cheek. And then some of around the nose here has got some dark areas as well, like this, and you can see I can overlap, and that's not going to move because it's dried now. And I'm just going to start to pull those in using just water. And that came quite green heavy, so I can add a little bit of blue to that, like so, just to vary it, get more of a turquoise colour, and that's going to help with my tonal variation as well. When we're doing this, when we're working with colour as a representation of tone, the types of colour that you make are going to help to communicate the tone. And where necessary, not using a lot of water, just building up the tone a little bit more. As you do this, and the more that you do this, the more careful you have to be with the pressure that you're applying and the amount of times that you're touching the paper, because we don't want that to be compromised at all. So I'm not going to add any more water to there at the minute, because I think that's going to start to damage the paper slightly. Okay, now what I need to do, once I've got this base down, is I need to let that dry if I want to work on top of it. Because if I start to work on top of it now, the paper's a little bit weak because it's wet. So then what that means is that when I start to apply my next material on top of it, it's probably going to cause a little bit of damage to the paper. So as I'm letting that part dry, I'm just going to keep on working down like this. Starting to add in some of the details, always referring back to the picture to see how tone is working, where I need to change my colour, and trying to coordinate to get it as realistic as possible. And you can see that if you want a nice smooth line running, what you need to do is use long strokes like this. A lot of the time when people are really conscious that they want something to be perfect, a couple of things happen. One thing, they put too much tension in their hand, and then they get furry lines like this, or they do little marks like this, and then again it's furry. If you want a nice smooth sharp line, just use long brush strokes like so. Okay, I'm going to start pulling some of this out. Actually, what I should show you is with just a little bit of water, I can then go back and correct that. And you can also see that I'm never using the whole of my brush. If I was to press my brush down, then it goes over a lot of surface area. I just use my tip. I'm always using a very gentle, very considered amount of pressure, and that helps with the paper and not damaging it, and also helps with the levels of precision that you can see within my work. I'm going to introduce another tone of blue here. This bit's pretty dark, so I'm going to start to work that in. One good thing when you're working with mixed media, obviously we're using the watercolour as a base here, and that's going to get our tonal definition. We can emphasise that tonal variation and all of the details and textures within the image as we start to build the materials on top of that. And that's a really good thing to do, because then we're adding lots of depth to our image. Just gonna just water here, and I'm gonna start to introduce some of that green coming down around here too, as we start to change and go into a heavier tone. Not overworking anything too much. Always considering that paper quality, the amount of water that we have. There we go. You can see that in some areas like here, I'm going to leave that nice texture in. I don't need it to seamlessly blend, because that's adding to showing the contours of the face. Same over here. I think by and large this part is almost dry. So I'm just going to wait for that for 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to start to introduce some of the materials. Thinking about the materials that I've got with me here and the nature of them, I've got a biro, which we know works in the same way as a pen. Adjust your pressure, you'll be able to change the marks. This is good when we're using cross-hatching techniques. Also good with graduating, but your marks are visible quite a lot, so that means that you want to consider the quality of your marks and make sure that you're contouring to show the form of the face. Then we've got pencil, and I'm using a 2B, which means that the lead inside is softer than a HB, which means it'll be easier to blend from one tone to the next, and I won't have to put as much pressure on to get some of the darker tones. I've got a different colour biro, some red. I've got a white pen in case I want to add any highlights in, and I've got a fine liner, and then also an ink pen. With these two, if these react to water, they're going to spread out. So if I go over to this side of the page, you can use a fine liner like that if you want to. So if I wanted to add, let's say, some cross-hatching in over here, like so, then if I was to get my brush with a little bit of water on it and add some to it, you can see you can start to spread the colour a little bit. So you can use it in that way. I'm going to use it on the dry area today, so I don't want it to bleed. Because of that, I'll have to make sure that that's nice and dry, otherwise I won't be able to make precise marks with this. Other materials that I could use, I've got these pens. which are fine tip felt pens. They could add some colour in and some texture. I don't think I'm going to use those today. And I've also got some colour pencils. I've got some Prismacolors, which we know are really high quality coloured pencils, but any coloured pencils will work well because you've got a lot of depth of colour going on here anyway. Okay, so I'm going to start to think about some techniques that I can apply now. When I'm using Biro, I think I'm going to use cross-hatching techniques. When I'm using fine liner, I'm going to use stippling techniques, and then if I'm using pencil, I'm going to use graduated tone. So all of these things are going to help add variation and more depth and more detail to my work. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to use my Biro to go in and start to define some of the details. So I've got it on black, but you can use a different colour if you think it's more suited. And I'm just going to start working into the eye area like so, adding a little bit more tonal depth, and you can see that that's immediately having an impact. We're starting to get some detail in there as well. We're starting to get a little bit more depth and a little bit more realism in there. I'm going to add some of these textures that we see in the eye like so, and then just working around. Introducing my cross hatching, I want to add a little bit of shadow coming from the top lid into the white of the eye. So to do that, I'm going to do some straight lines, just lightly coming down like that. And then I'm going to cross hatch that with some curved lines that follow the contour of the eye like that. And just really gently. We know that with cross hatching, the closer together our marks, the darker the tone, the further apart, the lighter the tone. But we can also play with pressure here as well. I'm also going to use this to redefine around here, and again cross hatching. These curves are going to follow that curved line around there, and I'm not actually going to cross these over. I'm just going to leave it as hatching, which means just a single line like that. And then over here I'm going to start to add some details in of the eyelashes like so. And these dry materials are really good for that because we know they're the ones that we're most comfortable with. We can get a lot of precision in there, and I can start to add this wherever I want. There's a lot of freedom involved with this, so you can make artistic choices with it. So here I want to emphasize the dark tone, and you can see that although my lines are straight, where they end creates a curve that follows around the face like this, and then the line that I come down with is gonna follow that curve there as well. And if I want a lighter tone, I'm going to adjust my pressure slightly and then just use hatching to spread that out like that. Around here I think I might introduce a little bit of fine liner to emphasize this the bridge of the nose here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some stippling techniques. So the closer together my dots are, the darker the tone is, and the further apart my dots are, as I'm gradually starting to make them further apart, the lighter the tone is. Just like so. And you can see that that starts to introduce a new texture, and I could do some outlining with the stippling as well. And also really emphasize that tonal depth here where I've got some lines and wrinkles under the eye. I'm going to start to like kind of spread my stippling out. What I've came across here is there's a little bit of a wet patch there, so the fine liner is reacting a little bit, but that's okay. And then I'm just going to layer this on some of the cross hatching there to follow that lighter tone by spreading them out quite a lot. Just like that. And then here you can see I can continue with that. Like so. And then we're starting to get lots of variation. We're showing different skills and techniques, and we're really starting to build on the image. I can also introduce some pencil to this, and I can do that where I've got the other areas. So here I just might want to emphasize this tone a little bit, add a little bit more quality to it. So I'm just putting that over there. That'll leave a little shiny film as well. I might want to redefine this area with a little bit of pencil, or just start to add some more hatching or some graduated tone here. And all of this is just building, working with what we've got. If it's not working with what we've got, we're going to have a problem, because obviously we want this to look like one coherent, complete piece of work. So I'm just going to use some curves here to start to emphasize that under the eye as well. And you can see in this way I'm just starting to build a little bit more tone, texture and detail in the image, and I would carry on around the image applying this as I go along. I would work in small sections like this, so I'd work here, then move down to here with my watercolour so that this has the opportunity to dry, then I'd work on top of that, and then I'd go and do another section of watercolour and then work on this when it's dried, so that I can just move around the piece and start to build it up, rather than putting all watercolour, then all pen, because what happens then is you don't give yourself a chance to understand the materials and how they're working together, and you don't really consider the image as a whole. What we want to do is zone into little areas so you can get all of the detail, and then what we do is we build up detailed area upon detailed area upon detailed area, so we have the whole image detailed in the end. What you run the risk of doing if you do it in all layers is you just capture the big details rather than the little details. If you wanted to as well, as I mentioned earlier, you can add some other colours, so just to add a bit of contrast I might add some red like this. And again, always be mindful of the quality of the paper. This is getting a little bit weak here, so I know that I'm not going to do much else on there. I'm not going to work on top of that much more, because then I'll damage my paper. If I was to damage my paper, it wouldn't mean I'd necessarily have to start again. Just contact me if that happens and I can help guide you through how we can work with that. So that's some mixed media techniques for you. I'm going to go on and complete this now, and I'll catch you later to learn about some more materials and some different ways of combining them.